Water slammed against the glass hard enough to rattle the frames, and for a split second I thought the windows would give. Outside, headlights floated where driveways used to be. Someone was screaming my name through the rain, a thin sound swallowed by the storm. I stood behind the wall they'd mocked for months, dry socks on my feet, watching the neighborhood drown while my house stayed still. I didn't always live behind a concrete barrier that made people uncomfortable. I moved here because it was quiet, because the land dipped gently toward a creek that most years barely whispered. I'm a civil engineer by trade, retired early after decades of studying how water behaves when people pretend it won't. The development brochure bragged about modern drainage. Perfect grading, zero flood risk. What it didn't show were the old contour maps, the buried channels. Away. This land had carried water long before houses sat on it. My wife and I bought anyway, eyes open, knowing what most didn't. Everything we owned was in this house. Everything we'd saved for was tied to the ground beneath it. The hostility started the day the wall went up. Not fences or hedges, but a solid, reinforced flood wall set back from the street tied into the foundation. Designed to redirect surge water back toward the natural channel. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't meant to be. Within hours, photos were circulating. Within days, the HOA board was knocking. They laughed openly like I was playing pretend. One of them told me I was scaring buyers. Another said I was insulting the neighborhood by acting like disaster was coming. I tried to explain the soil saturation, the storm cycles shifting, the fact that a 100-year flood didn't wait for permission. They heard none of it. The moment things turned truly hostile came during a community meeting held in the clubhouse. I brought diagrams not to show off, but because numbers speak when people won't listen. The board chair didn't even let me finish. She waved my papers away and told me the wall violated aesthetic guidelines. Then she slid a notice across the table. Already printed, already signed. 30 days to remove it or face daily fines and legal action. The room murmured approval. Someone joked about me building a bunker. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear, but certainty. Once that wall came down, there was no undoing what would follow. Pressure didn't come all at once. It came in waves, like the water would later. First were the letters. Official language, friendly threats. Each one ended with a reminder that compliance was cheaper than resistance. I lay awake nights replaying the meeting, hearing the laughter, wondering if I was wrong this time. Then the consequences started. A neighbor stopped letting his kids ride bikes past our house. Another confronted my wife at the mailbox, asking why we thought we were better than everyone else. The wall became a symbol, and I became the villain. The uncertainty gnawed at me. If I fought this and lost, I'd be the stubborn fool who wasted everything. The next escalation came with a surveyor. The HOA hired one to verify that my wall encroached on shared land. I watched from my porch as he measured carefully, professionally, and quietly told the board rep that everything was within my lot. They smiled anyway, thanked him, and sent me a violation notice that afternoon, claiming the opposite. I felt anger spike, sharp and hot. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about power. I filed a response, cited the survey, and waited. The mini cliffhanger sat heavy. Would facts matter? Or was this already decided? They retaliated by cutting access. Overnight, they closed the secondary drainage gate upstream, claiming maintenance. I drove out to see it change shut, water already pooling where it never should. My internal alarm screamed. This wasn't just harassment. This was dangerous. I emailed, called, documented everything. No response. That night, rain started falling harder than forecasted. I stood in the yard, flashlight cutting through sheets of water, watching levels rise. The wall held, but the street didn't. I wondered how many inches it would take before denial turned to panic. The mid-story twist didn't arrive as thunder. It arrived as a memory. Years ago, I'd consulted on a municipal project not far from here. Same watershed, same soil. I pulled the old files, spread them across the kitchen table, and there it was. A clause requiring open drainage paths, never to be obstructed by private entities. The HOA had inherited responsibility when the developer dissolved. By closing that gate, they'd violated not just guidelines but state law. My hand shook as I realized the leverage sitting in my drawer. The entire conflict reframed itself. I wasn't the problem. I was the last safeguard. The storm intensified faster than models predicted. Rain hammered the roof like gravel. I got a call from the board chair, her tone suddenly tight, asking if I'd noticed any flooding. I looked at the gauges, at the wall, doing exactly what it was built to do. I told her yes, and that the gate needed to be opened immediately. She said they were discussing it. Minutes felt like hours. Outside, water spilled over curbs, creeping toward doors. Inside, my house stayed calm, an island of dry floor and steady power. The pressure peaked as I heard pounding at the front gate, voices now urgent, afraid. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a heavy sadness as I watched neighbors I'd tried to warn wade through chest-deep water, carrying what they could. Someone shouted that they'd been wrong. Someone else begged me to open the wall as if it were a dam I controlled. I opened my door instead, letting people shelter where they could. The consequence was undeniable. Their homes filled. Mine didn't. The uncertainty hung in the air. When the water receded, what would they do next? By dawn, the storm passed, leaving silence and debris. Mud-coated lawns. Furniture lay overturned. The wall stood stained but intact. I sat on the steps, exhausted, replaying everything. This wasn't victory. It was validation bought at a terrible price. The board would come knocking again, but this time with lawyers, apologies, or both. As the sun rose, I asked myself a question that still hasn't left me. If you know disaster is coming and build to survive it, are you selfish for protecting yourself or responsible for refusing to pretend along with everyone else? The morning after the flood didn't feel like morning at all. It felt like the pause after something breaks, when sound hasn't rushed back in yet. I stepped outside early, boots sinking into mud that used to be grass, and the smell hit me first. Wet drywall, gasoline, sewage. The neighborhood looked flattened, not by force, but by surrender. Doors hung open, swollen and crooked. Cars sat half-buried, where water had shoved them. People moved slowly, like they were afraid the ground might betray them again if they rushed. Inside my house, everything was where I'd left it. Dry floors. Power still on. Coffee brewed like any other day. That contrast weighed on me more than the storm itself. I kept thinking someone would accuse me of cheating, like I'd found a way to opt out of a shared tragedy. When I stepped back outside, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes followed me. Not angry yet, confused, measuring. By noon, the HOA board called an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted distance, wanted to let the facts speak without me in the room. But another part knew silence would look like guilt. I walked in and saw faces I barely recognized. The same people who'd laughed now looked hollowed out. The board chair sat stiff, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She didn't open with rules or fines this time. She opened with damage estimates, insurance delays, displacement timelines. Every sentence landed heavier than the last. Then she turned to me, not with anger, but with something close to accusation. She asked how I'd known. I answered honestly. I'd studied the land. I'd read the reports. I'd warned them. The room shifted. Someone muttered that I should have pushed harder. Another said I'd scared people. My internal reaction surprised me. I wasn't defensive. I was tired. I told them knowing isn't the same as being listened to, and that fear of looking foolish doesn't stop water. That's when the questions changed tone. They asked about my wall, how it worked, if it could be extended, if it could help them now. The visible consequence of their earlier choices was sitting all around us, dripping from clothes and paperwork. I explained that it wasn't a barrier meant to trap water. It redirected flow back to where it belonged. Extending it now would be impossible without heavy equipment and time. Time they no longer had. The mini cliffhanger hung there. If my wall wasn't the solution, what was? The answer came from my own memory again. That closed gate. I brought it up calmly, laid out the regulation they'd violated. The room went silent. The board chair's face flushed. She said the gate closure was temporary. I said temporary still counted, especially when it caused damage. I watched the realization spread. This wasn't just a natural disaster anymore. It was negligence. Pressure escalated fast after that. Lawyers got involved before cleanup crews did. The HOA's attorney called me that afternoon, voice clipped, asking for a private conversation. He wanted to know exactly what I had documented. I told him everything. Emails, photos, timestamps. He paused longer than he meant to. The consequence of their actions was crystallizing into liability. The uncertainty shifted. I wasn't wondering if I'd be forced to tear down my wall anymore. They were wondering how much this would cost them. Neighbors started coming by my house, one at a time. Some to apologize. Some to ask questions. Some just to look at the wall up close, like it might explain everything if they stared long enough. One man broke down in my driveway saying he had lost his workshop, his tools, years of work. I listened. I didn't say I told you so. The internal thought that kept surfacing was that preparation looks like arrogance until it looks like survival. A week later, the board issued a formal suspension of all action against my property. No apology, just language about reevaluation. It would have felt like vindication if it hadn't come wrapped in silence about the gate. I pushed harder. I filed a complaint with the county. That's when the next antagonist action landed. The HOA accused me of exploiting the disaster for personal protection. They claimed my wall had redirected water toward other homes. The accusations spread fast. Social media posts. Group emails. I felt the old anger rise again, sharper this time. Not because it was personal, but because it was wrong. I responded with data. Flow models. Elevation maps. Before and after comparisons. I explained that water doesn't choose victims based on feelings. It follows physics. The visible consequence was a shift in tone from some neighbors, but not all. A few doubled down, needing someone to blame. The mini cliffhanger tightened. Facts were on my side, but emotions were loud. The mid-story twist arrived when the county inspector released their preliminary findings. The gate closure was cited as a primary contributor to the flooding severity. Responsibility fell squarely on the HOA. The same board that had threatened me was now facing potential lawsuits from its own members. The entire narrative flipped. Suddenly my wall wasn't a selfish act. It was evidence of what could have been done. The final confrontation of this chapter came during a second meeting, this time packed wall to wall. Voices rose. Accusations flew. The board chair tried to regain control, but the room had turned on her. People demanded resignations. They demanded explanations. Someone asked why warnings were ignored. All eyes drifted back to me. I stood, heart pounding, and said I didn't want their homes to flood. I wanted them to stop pretending risk was an insult. When the meeting ended, nothing was resolved, but everything had changed. The board would be restructured. Investigations would continue. As I walked home through drying mud, I felt something settle that wasn't relief. It was resolve. This wasn't over. The storm had exposed more than drainage failures. It had exposed how easily people trade reality for comfort, and how hard they fight when that illusion breaks. The weeks that followed felt heavier than the storm itself. Water leaves fast, but consequences linger. Cleanup crews came and went. Dumpsters lined the streets, and the neighborhood slowly shed the look of a disaster zone. What didn't fade was the tension. Every interaction carried weight now. A nod meant something. Silence meant more. I could feel the narrative still shifting, unstable, like ground that hadn't fully dried. The HOA board stopped sending letters, but that didn't mean they stopped acting. Their next move was quieter, and in some ways more aggressive. They commissioned an independent review of flood mitigation across the neighborhood. On the surface, it sounded responsible. In reality, it was a way to regain control of the story. If they could frame the flood as unpredictable, unavoidable, then no one had to answer for the gate, or the warnings, or the pressure they'd put on me. I was invited to participate. Not as a collaborator, but as a stakeholder. The word made my jaw tighten. I agreed anyway. If they were going to rebuild a version of reality, I wanted a seat where I could see the seams. The first meeting with the consultants was polite, almost too polite. They asked about rainfall intensity, about my wall design, about what I'd observed during the peak of the storm. I answered carefully, choosing precision over tone. Inside, my thoughts kept looping. If they dilute this enough, people will accept it. People want simple explanations. They want no one to be at fault. The antagonist action came when the draft report circulated. It concluded that while the gate closure may have contributed, the primary cause was an extraordinary weather event. The phrase jumped off the page. Extraordinary meant rare. Rare meant unforeseeable. Unforeseeable meant forgiven. I felt heat rise behind my eyes. This wasn't analysis. This was narrative management. I spent the night annotating the report line by line. Every assumption, every vague phrase, every omission. I pulled historical rainfall data, showed the trend lines. I highlighted the regulations they'd ignored. I included photos of the chained gate with timestamps. When I finished, dawn was breaking, and I felt that familiar mix of exhaustion and clarity. If this went unchallenged, the truth would be buried under paperwork. The visible consequence of my response was immediate pushback. The consultant emailed me privately, suggesting my tone was adversarial. The board chair echoed that sentiment in a group message, saying emotions were still raw and cooperation mattered. My internal reaction surprised me again. I wasn't angry. I was resolved. Cooperation didn't mean silence. It meant honesty, even when it was inconvenient. Neighbors started choosing sides. Some thanked me for speaking up. Others avoided me entirely. One afternoon, a woman I barely knew confronted me on the sidewalk, saying my insistence on blame was delaying healing. I thought about her words for hours afterward. Was I keeping wounds open, or preventing them from being reopened later? The uncertainty pressed in. There's a thin line between accountability and obsession. The pressure escalated when lawsuits were filed. Multiple homeowners sued the HOA for negligence. Depositions were scheduled. Subpoenas went out. I was named as a witness in more than one case. The board's attorney called again, this time with a softer voice, asking if I'd be willing to clarify certain points to avoid unnecessary conflict. I told him I'd clarify facts, not soften them. The line went quiet for a beat too long. Sitting for deposition was like reliving the storm in slow motion. Every decision dissected. Every email read aloud. They asked why I hadn't gone door to door warning people. They asked if I'd considered the visual impact of my wall. They asked if I believed my actions had influenced water flow toward other homes. Each question felt like a test not of facts, but of character. Inside, my thoughts kept returning to the same place. Preparation isn't an accusation. It's a choice. The mini cliffhanger tightened when the consultant revised their report again, this time acknowledging the gate closure more explicitly, but still hedging. It was enough to anger the board and embolden the plaintiffs. Tension between those groups became visible. Meetings grew heated. Voices rose. The board chair announced she would step down at the end of her term. It sounded like an ending, but it wasn't. It was a pivot. The mid-story twist came from an unexpected direction. A former maintenance contractor reached out to me directly. He'd seen my name mentioned online and recognized the situation. Over coffee, he told me he'd warned the HOA years earlier about the gate system, about deferred maintenance, about the risk of manual closures. He'd been ignored, then let go. He still had copies of his reports. My hands trembled slightly as he slid them across the table. This wasn't just about one storm. It was a pattern. With his permission, I shared the documents with the county and the plaintiff's attorneys. The effect was immediate. The narrative shifted again, harder this time. The flood wasn't an anomaly. It was the inevitable result of choices stacked over years. The visible consequence was panic within the HOA leadership. Emergency sessions, closed-door meetings, resignations came faster now. Neighbors who had blamed me started apologizing again, this time quieter, more sincere. One man admitted he'd voted against infrastructure spending because he didn't want higher fees. He said he thought warnings were just scare tactics. I listened, nodding, feeling that mix of empathy and frustration. The internal thought that kept surfacing was how expensive denial can be when it finally comes due. The final confrontation of this chapter unfolded at a town hall organized by the county. It wasn't mandatory, but it was packed. Officials presented findings. Lawyers spoke in careful language. Then the floor opened. The board chair, days from officially stepping down, took the microphone. She spoke about lessons learned, about moving forward. When she mentioned shared responsibility, a murmur spread through the room. I stood up, heart pounding, and asked a simple question. Why were warnings dismissed? Why was the gate closed? Why were aesthetics prioritized over safety? She didn't answer directly. She talked about context, about information overload. The room grew restless. Someone else shouted that their basement was still unlivable. Another demanded to know where the fees had gone. The pressure peaked, raw and undeniable. When I sat back down, my hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the release of holding back for so long. The meeting ended without closure, but with something more important. The truth was now public, spoken aloud, impossible to ignore. Walking home that night, the neighborhood felt different. Not healed, not whole, but awake. The wall along my property caught the light from the street lamps, still stark, still unapologetic. I realized then that the fight wasn't just about water or concrete or rules. It was about whether we're willing to face uncomfortable realities before they force themselves on us. And as much as I wanted this to be over, I knew one more reckoning still waited ahead. By the time the final reckoning arrived, the neighborhood no longer looked like the place we'd moved into. Fresh drywall hid old water lines. New sod-covered soil that still felt unstable underfoot. On the surface, things were improving. Underneath, everything was still unsettled. The lawsuits moved faster than anyone expected. Once the contractor's reports entered the record, momentum shifted hard. The HOA's insurance carrier sent its own investigators. Then another. Each one came back with the same conclusion, just dressed in different language. The flood wasn't unavoidable. It wasn't unprecedented. It was the result of ignored warnings and a system deliberately compromised to avoid inconvenience. That's when the HOA made its last move. They didn't come after the wall directly this time. Instead, they proposed a new emergency ordinance. Temporary, they said. Uniform, they said. All properties would be required to allow unrestricted surface flow during extreme weather events. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In practice, it would force me to breach the wall under the guise of community safety. The notice landed in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon. I stood in the driveway reading it twice, then a third time, feeling the old, familiar pressure settle in my chest. This was different from before. Smarter, cleaner. If they succeeded, they wouldn't have to admit fault. They'd turn my preparation into a violation disguised as cooperation. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the storm, the screams, the pounding on my gate. I thought about the people who'd lost everything, and about how easily this could be framed as me choosing myself again. The internal conflict was sharper now. This wasn't about being right. It was about whether standing firm would make things worse for everyone else. The escalation came quickly. The board scheduled a vote with minimal notice. Flyers went up around the neighborhood urging unity and shared sacrifice. My name wasn't mentioned, but everyone knew who the policy targeted. Neighbors started knocking again, not to apologize this time, but to persuade. Some begged, some accused. One man told me if I cared at all, I'd open the wall and let the water flow naturally next time. That word stuck with me. Naturally. Water had flowed naturally here long before houses, long before boards and bylaws. What they were asking wasn't natural. It was convenient. I called the county engineer directly. We'd spoken briefly during the investigation, but this time I laid everything out. The proposed ordinance, the timeline, the intent behind it. He listened quietly, then asked me to email the documents. An hour later, he called back and said something I hadn't expected. They don't have the authority to do this. The relief hit hard, followed immediately by resolve. If the board wanted one last confrontation, they were about to have it. The final meeting took place in the same clubhouse where they'd laughed months earlier. It was packed beyond capacity. People stood along the walls, some still in work clothes, others holding notebooks and phones. The atmosphere was brittle, like glass under tension. The board chair, now officially resigned but still present, sat in the front row. The interim president opened with a speech about healing and moving forward. He framed the ordinance as a way to prevent division. As he spoke, I watched faces in the crowd. Some nodded. Others looked uncertain. Fear still lingered, and fear makes people reach for simple answers. When public comments opened, I stood. I didn't bring diagrams this time. I didn't bring reports or maps. I brought a single photograph. The chained gate taken, the night of the storm, water already backing up behind it. I held it up so everyone could see. I spoke slowly, keeping my voice steady. I reminded them of the warnings that had been dismissed, the maintenance reports that had been ignored, the gate that had been closed without authority. I explained that my wall hadn't caused the flood. It had exposed the difference between preparation and denial. Then I addressed the ordinance directly. I explained why it wouldn't protect them, why breaching barriers without fixing root causes only spreads damage, why forcing compliance without accountability guarantees repetition. The room was quiet when I finished. Not silent in agreement, silent in reckoning. The interim president tried to respond, but he was interrupted. First by a homeowner asking why the gate system still hadn't been fully automated, then by another demanding a breakdown of where HOA funds had gone for the last decade. Voices layered over each other. The pressure surged, uncontrolled now. The vote was called anyway. It failed. Not narrowly, decisively. People stood, some clapping, others exhaling like they'd been holding their breath for months. The ordinance died right there, exposed for what it was. A shortcut. A deflection. An attempt to rewrite responsibility. In the weeks that followed, real changes finally started. The gate system was rebuilt and automated under county supervision. Drainage channels were restored to their original paths. Fees went up predictably, but this time with transparency. A new board was elected, quieter, more cautious. As for the lawsuits, they settled out of court. The HOA's insurance paid out heavily. Part of the agreement required mandatory risk assessments every 5 years conducted independently. It wasn't justice in the dramatic sense. It was accountability in the boring, durable sense, the kind that actually lasts. Life slowly returned to something like normal. Kids rode bikes again. Lawns regrew. Conversations shifted back to everyday things. The wall remained. No one mentioned tearing it down anymore. One evening, months later, I stood outside as a smaller storm rolled in. Rain fell steadily, testing the systems, the channels, the gates. Water flowed where it was supposed to. The wall guided it cleanly past my home and back toward the creek. No panic, no shouting, just rain doing what rain does when it's respected. A neighbor walked over, hands in his pockets, watching alongside me. After a while, he said he used to think preparation was pessimism. Now he wasn't so sure. I nodded, feeling the weight of everything finally ease. I still think about that first night, about the moment when laughter turned into pleading, not with satisfaction. With clarity, comfort is easy to defend until it collapses. Responsibility is harder. It requires admitting risk before it demands payment. So here's the question I can't answer for everyone else. When you see disaster coming and build to survive it, is it wrong to stand firm when others chose not to listen? Or is that exactly the kind of responsibility we expect from people who know better?